God only can make what you can.
Hate to interrupt everybody.
Thank you, that was awesome.
Yeah, I can tell. People were really getting fired up. I don't want any fights to break out. Any reflections on that little exchange?
I learned something.
Okay.
We were talking about scripture and like I said in the Old Testament it says,
Yeah.
and I was just told it's not the Old Testament, it is the Torah, and that's a very Christian term, and I'm going to be very cognizant of that from now on.
Right. Yeah.
Or just say Hebrew
Bible. So this is a tricky thing. So first of all, we were in Israel together, and I found it so phenomenally interesting because we heard from one of the larger Christian groups about some of the issues that are happening there, and there's just terrible genocides that have been happening. About what's happened in Syria and Iraq in particular, the going from huge communities to almost no one left. But as this person was speaking, I don't remember, he was the bishop of one of the churches, I think.
The Orthodox.
Yeah, the Orthodox.
Yeah.
He kept using the word Tanakh. Tanakh is the Bible in Hebrew. It's an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. So Torah, the 5 books, Nevi'im, the first set of prophets, and Ketuvim, these later writings. And that is how you say Bible in Hebrew. And it was just like I had to take a step back. Do Christians use Tanakh when they're in Hebrew in Israel? Because that's the normative way to say it.
Yeah.
So on one hand, and I'm on the boundary, in terms of people using the Old Testament. Sometimes I use that. On one hand, I would, tell ministers, hey, it's kind of pejorative, and, from the Jewish community side. But on the other hand, I just understand this is the stand-in for Bible. It's not meant when someone says it. So I think for some of the Jewish community, it's like inflaming, and then some, so you never know. I mean, that's the tricky thing.
But why even go there if you know, if you understand and intellectually understand? Why would I want to inflame anybody? That makes no sense.
Yeah, I think traditionally for the church, Old Testament was not intended to mean obsolete.
Right.
It was intended to mean historically, and old and new. But over time, it's come to be sort of understood that way, so a lot of churches in here we try to refer to the Hebrew Scripture as opposed to Old Testament, and a Christian, the Christian version of Tanakh is actually different than the Tanakh. I mean, it may have all the same books, but not in the same order. And there's a reason for that.
It's not even the same set of books. It's not even the same set of books.
Not entirely, yeah. Yeah, there are some differences. But the order itself is done for a reason. It's interesting to sort of explore that a little bit, too, because the Tanakh ends with 2 Chronicles. They will go up, and it's about return to Jerusalem, whereas the Christian version ends with Malachi, which talks about the coming of the Messiah. And so this is why they've been ordered in the way they are. At least that's from the Christian side. I don't know about the
So you have the same the same rubric, but just how it's looked at different, and the primary scriptures. That's tricky too. So we use Gospels. I've seen that more. In terms of talking about the Christian writing, as opposed to New Testament.
Right. Yeah, because the New Testament has Gospels and letters. It's not just So.
Or if you slip, you could just say older and newer.
Older and newer.
Thank you.
A term that I'm quite comfortable with, even though it's not technically accurate completely, as you just pointed out, but shared. There's a testament that Jews and Christians share.
Right.
And so that's kind of comfortable.
And whenever you're reading the Christian scripture, whenever in that scripture is referred to, they're talking about Jewish scripture. They're not talking about, for instance, when Paul talks about the scriptures, he's not talking about the Gospels. He doesn't have the Gospels. He's talking about probably the Septuagint.
Right.
But certainly the Jewish scripture. So.
You see a Frank. So I learned something this week. I was listening to a podcast on this new book called Jew, which is about the term Jew itself.
Yeah.
And one of the things that the author was saying is that the term Jew, as it's used today, is somewhat pejorative. You know, sometimes you say Jew. You know, even if you look up Jew in Google, the majority of references are anti-Semitic tropes. And actually, it'll say on Google, they have an addendum or something that says, you know, look up Judaism if you want to learn. You know, they'll have like a little thing. Apparently, I didn't try this. But that one of the things in terms of translation, in terms of the Gospels and the Christian writings, is that there are groups now that would say, instead of using Jew, because they're not even talking about Jews, they're talking about Judeans. And it's corrupting the conversation by labeling it Jew within the context of the scripture. So just even like a slight subtle thing like that, by saying Judean, because clearly the Judeans and the issues that Jesus had are so different than what we're talking about the Jewish community today, even if there's somewhat of a continuity.
That's actually a good sort of segue into what we are actually going to be talking about, because you know, in John's gospel in particular, it's often referred to, you know, the Jews are often referred to as, you know, sort of Jesus' opponents. It's always the Jews. And even though the writer of that gospel certainly would have known that Jesus was a Jew and everybody following him was a Jew, but because of our translation, you know, we've sort of created this this rift that, you know, it's clear in the context of that gospel that he's talking about usually the sort of religious establishment figures, the religious leaders, but it's you know, creates this sense that Jesus is opposed to the Jews, which makes no sense at all, because he was a devout Jew. And that's how he lived his life. And so, you know, I guess that has been, for me anyway, one of the trickier obstacles to dialogue. Is how can we talk about who Jesus was in a way that's not doesn't create sort of tension between our.
One thing I feel so lucky in terms of the Jewish community, in terms of the Tanakh, is that all the people that were, you know, these ancient Israelites battled against, they're all gone. You know, even if you say like the Egyptians, you know, no one one I know ever thinks the Egyptians from the Tanakh, from the Bible, are the Egyptians today. Like, no one makes that conflation. You know, so fundamentally, you know, there's no more Babylonians and Assyrians or Phoenicians or Philistines or, you know, all these things. And it says in the Torah, you know, you have to wipe out the 7 nations. You know, if one of those nations was alive today, well, that would be really problematic, because, you know, you have scripture that every time, you know, can you imagine they walk into our synagogue and we'd be reading, you know, how we're going to wipe them out. But we've been, because of the thousands of years that separate our text from today and the amount of change in the world, we've been spared that. And unfortunately, as soon as you enter into the Christian and Muslim era, you guys aren't so lucky. You have to deal with the fact that there's still some continuity between what's written there and what's seen in the world today. And so we feel very lucky. We dodged a bullet. There's a funny joke about a Jewish boy who's misbehaving, and he's in Jewish schools, and it's just not working. So they pull him out, they bring him to Catholic school, and sure enough, he behaves. And the parents are just like really confused. So they go to the priest who's in charge of the school. They say, we don't know what's happening. How did our child? And they're sitting there with their son, and how did he say he's like such a good boy? And the son says, well, I walked in, I saw this guy hanging up there. Figured, wow, I'm gonna behave. There's another joke about it about Jew.
To the plus sign.
There's a Jew in a rainstorm, and he's looking for shelter, and he ends up in a Catholic church, and they're doing the ceremony for the nuns to be wedded to Jesus. And he's sitting there, he's drenched in water, and they say, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "Well, I'm with the groom's side." Creates all these kind of I'm sure that Bruce probably knows it.
That's a good one.
So what kinds of questions have you encountered around understandings of Jesus?
Basic question that I've been trying to find the answer to for years and years is,
Well, I'm sure we can find that answer.
well, I mean, that's why I was kind of excited about this topic here between the two different groups, is why Yeshua is not accepted by the Jewish people. When he was Jewish, he fulfilled many prophecies in the Tanakh. Well, all the prophecies for his birth, his first coming. And all his apostles were Jewish, and the original movement was all Jewish. It was all Messianic Judaism. It's only now that it's like the other way around. Back then it was like, how do we accept these dog Gentiles into our religion now, because they were all Jewish, and they were like, these Gentiles, we don't want them in our religion. But now it's the other way around, where it's, how do we accept the Jews? And
So David, I'm very glad you brought it up, because that probably the moment of discomfort is that question that often comes up. So, I certainly understand where you're coming from. This is not a question that is unusual to me. This is a question that comes up often, and often by strangers that would come up to me that are not connected to the Jewish community. I don't understand why you don't believe in Jesus, because Jesus is such a central part of a lot of Christians' life. It's everything. So how, why should you not do this and not be accepted into the, if that's all it requires to go to heaven or whatever, or why is this such a sticking point? And for Jews, obviously, the rift between these two communities, when the Christian communities began, really a couple under Constantine, and later as the divide becomes really cemented, and where communities are placed in separate places. It is true. There was certainly a time during Jesus